Today, we're going to be taking a look at some declassified documents all about clandestine activities around Cuba, early to mid-1960s, and I think you brought a really interesting collection. So,
Yeah, we talk a lot about Cuba on the show, and these are some really in-depth primary sources from this really intense period right after the Cuban Missile Crisis.
right, yeah. So this is really boots on the ground stuff, right?
Exactly.
We're not talking about high-level policy decisions or anything like that. This is really guys in the field trying to figure out what's going on, dealing with agents and all that kind of stuff. So
The nitty-gritty of intelligence work during a really volatile time.
yeah, and I think our mission today should be to really understand this historical period through the eyes of the people who were actually there. What were the operations that they were running, who were the people involved, and what were the challenges they faced.
I think that's a great goal. And these documents, even with the necessary redactions, do offer a fascinating window into that world.
So let's jump right in.
Let's do it.
The first operation that really caught my eye here is a ZR rifle.
Mm.
And, from what I've gathered, this seems to be a program that was designed to recruit Cuban technicians and then kind of insert them back into Cuba, right?
Yeah, but that's the gist of it. The idea was to leverage the skills and access of these Cuban technicians to gather intel.
Right. So these are people who presumably have some level of technical expertise.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they worked in sensitive industries, or maybe they had access to information that would be valuable to, U.S. intelligence.
Exactly. They could potentially provide insights into areas that were otherwise difficult to penetrate.
But it seems like this ZR rifle operation ran into some serious problems.
Mm-hmm.
The documents mention a loss of interest from potential recruits, and it seems like one of the key factors was the delay between application and approval.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we're talking 6 to 9 months.
Wow, that's a long time.
Yeah, that's an eternity in the world of espionage.
Yeah.
Things change so quickly.
Right. You can imagine that kind of delay would erode trust and create huge risks for everyone involved.
And it gets even worse because it wasn't just a timing issue. It also seems like the field stations were having a lot of trouble finding individuals who were considered politically reliable.
Yeah, vetting agents is always a critical challenge. And in this context, with the political tensions so high, it would have been even more difficult.
Right, and so you have this combination of factors, the delays, the vetting issues, and then on top of that, the documents explicitly say that the program was considered too expensive.
So they pulled the plug.
Well, they decided to discontinue intensive recruitment, through this channel at least. They weren't getting the bang for their buck.
It's a reminder that these operations, even the ones that seem promising on paper, can easily run into real-world obstacles.
Yeah, and I think the documents kind of sum it up when they say, discontinue the ZR rifle slug and file 200-120-47.
Sounds like they were ready to move on.
Yeah. They weren't messing around. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about something that really kind of jumps out from these documents, and that's the Soviet presence in Cuba. There are a lot of reports here that detail these unusual movements of Soviets, particularly around this place called Batabano and Isla de Pinos.
Right, and this was a huge concern for U.S. intelligence at the time. Remember, this is just a couple of years after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So any sign of Soviet activity was being watched very closely.
Exactly, and one of the reports that really caught my eye is from November 6, 1963. It mentions these 2 trucks that arrive in Batabano carrying about 24 men who were described as looking like Soviets. They're well-dressed, they're carrying suitcases and bundles the whole 9 yards, and they all board a ferry that's heading to Isla de Pinos.
Interesting.
And what's really strange is that the source who reported this says that this wasn't the regular ferry.
Really?
Yeah, he says the regular ferry to Isla de Pinos departs from Batabano for Girona on the night of November 6th. So this is like an extra ferry or something.
So an unscheduled departure with a group of well-dressed Soviets. That definitely raises some eyebrows.
Yeah, it definitely suggests that something out of the ordinary was happening.
And Isla de Pinos was a strategic location. It's relatively isolated and could have been used for various purposes.
Right. So you can see why intelligence would be very interested in this kind of unusual activity. It wasn't just this one incident either.
Right.
There are other reports from around the same time about olive green trailer trucks hauling boxes arriving at or departing from Batabano.
Mm.
And these trucks are often linked to the Isla de Pinos ferry.
So it seems like there was a consistent flow of something between the mainland and the island.
Yeah, and there's even a report that specifically mentions ZIL trucks.
Ah, those are Soviet-made trucks.
Exactly. So that kind of adds to the suspicion, right?
It definitely suggests a Soviet connection.
And then we have these reports of almost nightly truck movements heading towards this place called Torrens. It's southwest of Havana. It's the former reformatory on the Wajay Highway. And these trucks are often covered with canvas, which kind of suggests they're hiding something.
Covered convoys, especially at night, often indicate sensitive cargo. What makes this even more interesting is that one of the documents identifies the Torrens area as a surface-to-air missile assembly area active during this period.
Right, so we have these trucks that are potentially carrying something secret heading towards a known missile site.
Yeah, and there's even a report from October where someone observed these tube-like objects protruding from one of the trucks.
So it definitely adds to the intrigue.
It does.
Yeah.
It suggests that the Soviets may have been continuing to bolster Cuba's air defenses even after the missile crisis.
All right, well, let's move on to something a little different now. Let's talk about agents.
Okay.
There's a lot of information here about an agent codenamed AMCLER-1.
Mm.
And it seems like there were some concerns about his reliability early on. Yeah, there's a review from way back in 1962 that mentions some issues with his handling of funds and some questions about whether he could be trusted.
Managing agents is always tricky. You're dealing with individuals who are operating in a high-pressure environment, and there's always a risk of compromise or deception.
Right, and in this case, it seems like they decided to keep him on, despite the red flags.
Why was that?
Well, the documents say that he had this propaganda outlet that was publishing things that were of interest to Quebec.
Quebec was the agency's designation for intelligence related to internal Cuban political and social dynamics, so they valued his access to information and his ability to spread it, even if they had some doubts about his reliability.
Yeah, and then things get really interesting because in October of 1963, there's this whole story about AMCLER-1 defecting.
A defection story.
Yeah, it starts with a broadcast on Radio de las Americas from Montevideo. And then it spreads to Spanish-language newspapers all over the Americas.
What was the story?
The story basically says that veterans of the Grama expedition were facing a lot of hardships and that Castro was to blame.
The Grama expedition was the boat that Fidel and his revolutionaries sailed to Cuba on in 1956.
Right. It's like a foundational myth of the Cuban Revolution.
So this defection story was directly attacking the legitimacy of the revolution by claiming that even the original revolutionaries were disillusioned.
Exactly. And the story goes on to say that AMCLER-1 was placed under controlled conditions by Castro, which, adds to the drama.
It definitely makes it sound more believable.
Right. And the documents indicate that the agency took this defection story very seriously. They wanted to debrief AMCLER-1 as soon as possible.
Makes sense. They needed to know if he was actually defecting or if this was some kind of elaborate disinformation campaign.
Right. And there's also this mention of the Charles Griffin Trimp story.
What's that about?
So apparently J-Wave, which was a field station, instructed AMCLER-1 to select items that would discredit a hijacked shrimp boat called the Charles Griffin and another vessel called the Johnny Reb. Yeah, it seems like the Cubans were using this hijacking incident as propaganda.
To portray themselves as victims.
Exactly. And so J-Wave wanted to counter that narrative by providing information that would discredit the whole story.
So it's a classic example of counter-propaganda using information to shape the public narrative.
And there's even more. AMCLER-1 is also mentioned in connection with the LAYC story meeting in Santiago, Cuba in March 1964.
What happened there?
Well, it seems like AMCLER-1 contacted this guy, LAYC, and tasked him with preparing a story for publication.
So he's not just spreading information, he's actively managing a network of people to disseminate it.
It sounds like a pretty sophisticated operation.
It does, and it shows how agents can play a role in shaping the information landscape.
Now, shifting gears again, the documents also mention another operation called AMFAUNA-1. And it seems like this operation was compromised.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, in December 1963, they were trying to re-exfiltrate the agent.
Re-exfiltration is always risky, especially when an operation has been compromised.
Right. And it sounds like things were pretty desperate because they even mentioned eliminating AMFAUNA-14 and other direct threat security agents as initial sources.
Wow, so they were willing to take drastic measures to protect the compromised agent.
Yeah, and unfortunately, attempts to exfiltrate another agent, AMCLER-2, were unproductive.
So there were some losses.
Yeah, and there's also a report about contact with AMCLER-1 and surveillance of AMCLER-2's residence after his arrest in October 1963.
So they were trying to gather any intelligence they could after the arrest?
It really paints a picture of just how complex and interconnected this world of agents and operations was.
And this is just a small glimpse into what was happening at the time.
Right. There were probably countless other operations going on that we don't even know about.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's wrap up with a few other interesting tidbits from these documents.
Okay.
There's a mention of this Russian ship, the Krasnoye Znamya, which was expected to arrive in Havana in November 1963. And there's this request for information about its cargo, its destination descriptions of any Russians on board, and even if anyone owned a boat near Bahia Honda.
Bahia Honda is a coastal area, right?
Right, so it seems like they were concerned about the possibility of something being offloaded secretly.
Makes sense. Any Soviet ship arriving in Cuba would have been scrutinized very carefully.
And then there's this report about the recruitment of a young Cuban student named Jose. His alias was Achilles.
Achilles?
Yeah, and he's stationed on a boat called Aquila.
So they were using boats for intelligence gathering.
It seems so. He was based in Cayo La Visa, and he was just 18 years old.
Wow, that's young.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the report even mentions that he received medication for pernicious anemia.
So they were taking care of his health while he was working for them.
It's a reminder that behind all the code names and operations, these were real people with real lives.
Exactly. And then finally we have some more reports about Soviet travel from Batabano to Isla de Pinos. This time it's based on information from local residents who were recruited as informants.
So it seems like they were using a variety of sources to gather intelligence.
Yeah. Human intelligence was crucial in this kind of environment.
So taking a step back and looking at everything we've discussed today, what are some of the key takeaways that stand out to you?
Well, I think, first of all, it's clear that these clandestine operations were incredibly difficult to pull off.
Right.
I mean, we saw how ZR Rifle failed despite its initial promise, and that was just one example.
And I think it shows how important it is to have reliable agents and good information.
Absolutely. Without those things, even the best laid plans can fall apart.
And I think the second big takeaway is just how much attention was being paid to Soviet activities in Cuba.
Right. Even after the missile crisis, the U.S. was still very concerned about what the Soviets were up to.
And it's not surprising given what was at stake.
Yeah, the Cold War was a high-stakes game, and Cuba was a key battleground.
And finally, I think these documents really highlight the human side of intelligence work. You know, we see these agents who are risking their lives, often for very little reward.
And we see the challenges of managing them and keeping them safe.
It's a reminder that intelligence isn't just about gadgets and technology, it's about people.
It's about understanding human motivations and building trust.
And it's about making tough decisions with imperfect information.
Well said.
So I think that's a good place to wrap things up for today.
I agree.
You know, these documents offer a fascinating glimpse into a really complex and pivotal period in history.
They do, and they raise a lot of important questions about the nature of intelligence work and the challenges of navigating the Cold War.
So for our listeners out there, I'd like to leave you with this thought. How does this nuanced picture of clandestine activities in Cuba shape your understanding of the broader Cold War and the role of intelligence agencies in shaping the course of events? It's something to ponder.
Definitely.
Until next time.
Thanks for joining us.